Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for Pacific Forum's 7th Comparative Connections Roundtable on the subject of the U.S.-China rivalry and its impact on the Indo-Pacific. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, Editor at Comparative Connections, a triannual e-journal of bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific, and your MC for today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with the publication, Comparative Connections is published 3 times a year, providing timely analysis on key bilateral relationships across the Indo-Pacific. A link to the key findings from our previous roundtable on the topic of U.S. Indo-Pacific policy in the second half of Biden's term can be found in the chat box now. Every issue of Comparative Connections is made up of 13 regular chapters plus 1 rotating chapter appearing once yearly, each authored by recognized specialists who review critical developments within a given relationship and assess their implications for regional security, U.S. interests, and the future of the region at large. Each chapter also includes a carefully curated chronology section that synthesizes the day-to-day policy developments, diplomatic engagements, and bilateral exchanges that characterize the relationship. These chapter chronologies contribute to a running sortable chronology section of the website that dates back to the first issue of Comparative Connections in 1999. In addition to these analytical chapters and bilateral chronologies, the Comparative Connections website hosts 2 databases: the State Visits database dedicated to tracking official visits by heads of state, and our Multilateral Forums database, which similarly tracks the occurrence of select high-level meetings. The various components of this site complement one another to provide users with a holistic understanding of each bilateral relationship's rich history, contemporary successes and challenges, and future areas for cooperation. A link to view our most recent issue of Comparative Connections can be found in the chat box now. Today, to discuss the impact of the U.S.-China rivalry on the Indo-Pacific, we have 3 experts joining us. First, we have Sourabh Gupta, Resident Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies and author of our U.S.-China chapter. You can find his most recent chapter in the chat box now. He will be followed by the co-author of our U.S.-Japan chapter, Dr. Sheila Smith. Dr. Smith is the John E. Merrow Senior Fellow at Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. See the chat box for her most recent chapter. Our last but by no means least speaker for today will be the co-author of our China-Southeast Asia chapter, Dr. Robert Sutter, Professor of Practice of International Relations at the Elliott School of George Washington University. For his most recent chapter, check the chat box now. Our moderator for today will be the co-author of our regional overview, Ralph Kosa. Ralph is President Emeritus and WSD Honda Chair in Peace Studies here at Pacific Forum. Please check the chat box now for the most recent regional overview. I want to thank each of our distinguished participants for being here today. We look forward to your remarks and for the fruitful discussion that will certainly follow. After our panelists' presentations, we will transition into a Q&A segment where we will welcome feedback and questions from the audience. I would now like to give the floor to our moderator, Ralph Kosa.
Thank you, Rob. Aloha, everyone, and greetings to our panelists, all old friends. Let's get right into the topic, and Sourabh, we'll start with you, please.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Rob, and thanks to Pacific Forum and Comparative Connections. Let me get right away into the topic. What I wanted to speak about today is a broad overview of the Biden administration's approach to China and what has been China's response, and then just look forward a little bit as to a happy scenario and an unhappy scenario in the relationship. To phrase it simply, and as the Biden administration has itself said, its strategy is basically to invest, align, shape the environment, and compete with China. Or as Mr. Sullivan, National Security Advisor, has said, is to build situations of strength, utilizing a lattice work of alliances and partnerships from which to dictate the terms of competition with China. This administration, in my view, I think deserves enormous credit for matching tall words with actions in a short period of time. think about it in terms of shaping the environment and aligning. I'm talking geopolitics here. It's just the geopolitics. The Quad held its first leaders summit. The Quad has been there for a while. Its first leaders summit during the Biden presidency. AUKUS happened in September 2021. Australia, US, United Kingdom. Recently, we had the Northeast Asia Trilateral at Camp David, and trying to building jointness within the three parties. It has prioritized the Pacific Islands, and it has created the basing arrangements with Papua New Guinea, et cetera. It has, in my view, set in motion a veritable rearranging of the Indo-Pacific strategic furniture. And I think it deserves credit for that. This has to be, let's contrast this with the previous administration. Going out, National Security Advisor Rob O'Brien declassified the memo called the Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific. And if one looks at that memo, it essentially is a four-cornered geopolitical structure by which the United States will seek to engage China and contain China. Basically, for the Quad countries were the four principal hubs, as if nothing else in the middle mattered out there in Asia out there. And I know it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that, but that is how it approached matters. And what the Democratic administration has done, and I think this goes back to the Obama first term and Campbell's Kurt Campbell's belief in trilaterals and creating bespoke arrangements, which has really come to fruition in this administration. One thing I think that has not changed between this administration and the prior administration is, I think, when the prior administration talked in terms of the Western Pacific, it talked in terms of deny China sustained dominance within the First Alliance chain, defend First Alliance chain nations, First Island chain nations, including Taiwan, and dominate all domains outside the First Island chain. I think that part has not changed, and there has been continuity of it. Let's move then to the geo-economic context. The Biden administration has built on the tech denial regime that the Trump administration has started, and of course it has gone with this industrial policy on steroids. I think it's useful to just step back and recapitulate some of the major landmark, I would say, legislation and measures taken by both the Trump and the Biden administration in the geo-economic realm. I'll just run over them quickly because there isn't that much time. First, Section 301, tariffs, which I think were the least useful and continue to hurt the U.S. Next was the update to the CFIUS rules. It was called the Foreign Investment Risk Reduction Modernization Act, which ensured that minority Chinese acquisitions would not have access to kind of non-public technical information which they could take advantage of in the technology sphere. It was to clamp down out there. Then came the ICTS, Information Communication Technology and Services Order, which thereafter led to the Huawei, to basically kneecapping Huawei using the Foreign Direct Product Rule, wherein any American technology commingled in a product, even if it was built and produced outside the US, was denied to Huawei. And it really did bring Huawei down. Come to the Biden administration, we've had the CHIPS Act, we've had the Inflation Reduction Act, and its catalyzing of private finance for climate change. We've got the October 7th export control orders on semiconductors and computing, and then this year, just recently, we've had the outbound investment executive order. It's a screening order, and we probably will have some forthcoming action on TikTok too. That one is a little bit more complicated, but the point being that 5 of these actions, or 4 of 7 or 5 of 8, however you count it, have come in the Biden administration. So it's been very active on this front. And much of this was encapsulated in Jake Sullivan's speech, which I think which kind of ties together Biden administration's international economic policy approach. He gave it at Brookings earlier this April, and he called it a foreign policy for the middle class, but I think it's more an international economic policy for the middle class, where he talked of expanded industrial policy at home, building a techno-industrial base with like-minded partners. He talked of giving up on old free trade agreements and going for new international partnerships, which I think has been the weakest area, frankly, in this administration. He talked in terms of mobilizing large sums for climate change and anti-poverty programs and recapitalizing the multilateral banks. And finally, U.S. foundational technologies will be protected with a small yard, high fence approach. Real thinking has gone out here, but one has to point out and be clear about it. I mean, the United States cannot stay out of the trade liberalization game, particularly in providing market access, because frankly, for most countries in the Indo-Pacific, they are developing countries and they seek to go up the ladder of development, and trade is the means to do that. And even the supply chain matters have sometimes been done a little too rigidly. Think in terms of battery supply chains. Indonesia wants to be part within IPEF, wants to be part of that supply chain, but the US does not want it because there's a lot of Chinese acquisitions in the nickel space in Indonesia, and the US just wants China out. And therefore, if China has got to be out, that means even Indonesia has got to be out. And particularly in supply chains, on green supply chains, China has the lock in the market. And basically, if you're trying to decouple from China, you're ending up decoupling too much of that part of the world. And so this area really needs a little bit of work. And I think this has been the one big lacuna in administration policy. From the Chinese response has been to claim that, yeah, the United States is economically trying to build it out, diplomatically trying to isolate it, militarily trying to encircle it, developmentally trying to technologically suppress it. And besides, that has given incentives to all these countries to chip away at their relations with China. But of course, it does minimize its own role in the process of doing so. And we can come to that. I'll come to that later. But let me just carry on with what has China done in response. China doesn't have that really a fixed strategy. I mean, a 4-year strategy in the way that the Biden administration has, as an administration has, because it's termed out after that period of time. So, of course, China's talked in terms of self-reliance. It's talked in terms of countermeasures. But what I would suggest, and what has been missed out to some extent, is on the international geo-economic front, the amount of investment that it is making in its relations with the European Union, and particularly the Western European countries, is very significant and has gone under the radar. And it has been willing to take slaps from these guys and still hold out for that. Because frankly, for China now, its most important geo-economic partner is the Europeans, the European Union, particularly the Western Europeans. And the dilemma for China, of course, is that its most important geopolitical partner is the Russians, and the Russians are repellent as far as the Europeans are concerned. And so it's a delicate balancing act. And in the course of that balancing act, China is also simultaneously trying to work out guiding principles with the US at a time so that it can have some sort of peaceful coexistence. And at a time when the strategic furniture of the Indo-Pacific region is being reshaped. And it's a difficult choice, difficult act for China, because fundamentally the most important pillar, the most important strategic external ballast of its international strategy, of its national modernization strategy, has basically shifted to its disfavor. That being an enabling regional environment and having dense, integrated, trans-Pacific trade and technology ties. US has kicked that stool out, and that has been a central factor which has left China in a dilemma. And that's why my view is that one must pay a little more attention to the China-EU dynamic, and the EU has moved in this regard. We have to think very early on itself, after the 100-day talks collapsed and Huawei went into the doghouse. China signed, this is before COVID happened, China signed a comprehensive agreement on investment with the European Union, which was essentially kind of like a phase 2 deal, which the US was trying to go at, but found that China wasn't reaching that far. And let me suggest this, submit this point. if one looks at the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, the industrial policy and subsidies chapter, it is almost word to word in the comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU. And so China was willing to accept those terms at that point of time. And I would submit that on climate change in the area of digital policy, where it has basically mimicked all of the EU's legislation, that China has found a way to deepen its ties with Europe, and that ties should not be discounted. Let me
one more minute.
Yeah, let me conclude with just looking briefly out into the future, the happy scenario, more from a Chinese perspective, because the Americans are doing what they are doing and they've got their act in order, which is Biden, I'm talking 2-3 years out, Biden is elected. Democratic presidents in their second terms have been qualitatively different in their engagement in China. Clinton too, Obama too, had warm ties with China. Yes, we are in a new normal, but perhaps a chance is that many of the commitments that they have talked at Bali and earlier Biden's can be memorialized and can stabilize that relationship. That's the happy scenario. Unhappy scenario, a Republican president comes in the White House and Mr. William Lai wins in Taipei, and I think and the straits go on a boil, and we don't know where it goes from there. Let me stop at this point. Happy to take questions, and happy to take questions also on the issue of where's the Chinese economy going and how that might impact matters. Thanks very much.
Sourabh, thank you very much. Thank you for sticking pretty close to the time as well. You set a good example, which Sheila will now follow. Sheila.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ralph. And thank you, Pacific Forum, for including me in the conversation. It's fun to be back with you. I've got three basic large points from the position of how Japan is now viewing its relationship with the United States, but also with the other partners in the Indo-Pacific. I wanted to, the first point is just simply to remind you that Japan-China tensions began before the US and China announced strategic competition. So in the early 20 years of the 21st century, you were starting to see cracks in the fissures of the bilateral Japan-China relationship, a relationship that had largely been managed through high-level symmetry, very careful tending of problems, and a certain degree of problem-solving expertise that could be managed through those channels. But by the early 2000s, of course, you're starting to see problems with historical memory, Yasukuni Shrine visits, consumer issues in Japan with the dumplings, maritime boundaries, and of course, the Senkaku Island dispute flared up within the decade. So Japan-China relations had to shift gears, and in Tokyo, it took a while to shift those gears. Economic interdependence had largely been the way that Japanese political elites had seen of making sure that the relationship with China was stable, even through political tensions over various issues of the past. But the economic interdependence was beginning to become the problem as well. So what happened? The bilateral symmetry with China, the Abe cabinet, despite Abe's very strategic look at the Indo-Pacific, his free and open Indo-Pacific vision, we all know, was the boilerplate for what today we see coming out of the Quad. But even Abe really wanted that bilateral mechanism to work with Beijing. He went to China. They were on the cusp of welcoming Xi Jinping to Tokyo when the pandemic broke out in early 2020, and that basically interrupted a process of diplomacy between the two capitals. I think what's happened since then has largely been the lack of diplomacy, much like our relationship with China. But for the Japanese case, of course, there's other things afoot here in the region. You see a change in government from Abe, of course, after the assassination, to Suga, and then now to Kishida. But you see a real endorsement by Abe's successors of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Largely, that is Japan's effort at coalition building, but also at defining the geostrategic table, as Sourabh was talking about, but defining the values that Japan wanted to sustain and support in the Indo-Pacific with various partners. So you see the trilateralization of the US-Japan relationship with Australia, first of all, in 2008. And then you see again a trilateralizing of the US-Japan-India maritime exercises a few years later. Today, we are witnessing the realization of a trilateralizing of the US, Japan, Philippines relationship. So you're starting to see Japan knit itself into security partners of the United States in ways that we have never seen the Japanese really been willing to do in the past. But the larger vision, and of course the Quad is the lead venue to look for this vision. The larger vision really is making sure that the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific is sustained. And by that, that largely began with maritime security cooperation. The Japanese maritime self-defense forces today are a much more active instrument for Japanese strategic partnership building than they've ever been in the past. But it's a broader initiative, I think. It's an initiative to build the Australian, Indian, American, and Japanese capacities to be able to meet the region's needs. And that's very much the language that you'll find in Tokyo to discuss the Quad. So again, if you look at the Quad agenda, from the COVID vaccine provision to the infrastructure funding, to the maritime issues, but also the broader agenda of how to make sure that supply chains remain resilient. This is very much in line with how Japan sees its interest in the Indo-Pacific and sees the consensus building core for those four strategic partners in the Quad. You see also a continuity with this language on the rules-based order beyond the Indo-Pacific. And it's been really striking for me to watch the way in which Japan has reached out to the Europeans. And again, Sourabh was talking about the Chinese relationship with the Europeans, but Japan's relationship with the Europeans has also developed. And it's largely, I would say, an insurance policy to make sure that should there be issues of common concern, that the Europeans will see events in the Indo-Pacific as being less about regional issues and more about global norms, values, and standards. So you see things like Prime Minister Kishida was just in the region, in Europe, on the G7 tour in January this year, and he stopped to conclude and announce bilateral defense relationships with Italy, France, and the UK before he even arrived here in Washington. So this is a very different Japan, very forward-leaning, very strategic in its attempt to build coalitions, both with us, of course, but with the other Indo-Pacific players and European stakeholders. The last thing probably it's useful to put the spotlight back on is the bilateral Japan-China relationship. What's been interesting to me, again, I noted earlier that Prime Minister Abe, despite his strategic emphasis of the Indo-Pacific, still wanted to improve the bilat with Beijing and worked actually quite hard to persuade Beijing that, to use the Chinese phrase, it could have a win-win partnership in the Indo-Pacific. It didn't have to be antagonistic. And here, of course, there's a lot of opportunity for the infrastructure provision, for economic standards, for other kinds of projects that Japan and China could do together. Again, of course, the pandemic derailed that effort, and so we'll never know what would have become of it. What's been striking since the pandemic is the extent to which that bilateral diplomatic channel between Japan and China has really become more dependent on the US-China diplomacy. And you see that in, the Japanese have been asking for a foreign ministerial visit and perhaps even a prime ministerial visit to China, but there has been no progress until the United States, of course, until Secretary Blinken moved to go to Beijing, but that's still been stalled. And so Foreign Minister Hayashi has yet to lock in a bilat with Beijing. He did meet with Wang Yi in Jakarta in July, and the Chinese and the Japanese readout to that basically reflected a kind of stalemate. There was nothing new to be announced, but there was a little bit of a lecture by Wang Yi about the Cold War mentality and how it wasn't in Japan's interests or the region's interests for Japan to pursue this Cold War mentality. And a reminder to Japan, of course, of the history between the two and the history of Japanese aggression. Today, you see with the Fukushima water, the water release from the Fukushima plant, China was very quick to condemn Japan's pollution of the world's oceans and to use the moment to really chastise Japan. So you don't yet see that there's been a bilateral reconciliation, maybe too large of a word, but a bilateral restoration of a conversation about a diplomatic agenda going forward. One last piece of the puzzle that I think is really important, and most of you who are watching the security in the region will have noted this, but that Japan is much more willing to use the military, its self-defense forces, as a conduit for strategic cooperation across the region. Not in combat capacity, not in alliances, but they are much, much more willing to engage in thinking about potential crises in the region, how the self-defense forces and the Australian military, for example, will respond. The self-defense forces now practice in Darwin on Australian soil, which is quite striking. Again, I noted the Philippine security dialogue that includes Japanese self-defense forces exercising in the Philippines. Very new era for Japan in terms of its relationship with its neighbors. So there's two large takeaways here, Ralph. I'll end a little earlier than the clock. But there's two big takeaways. One is where Japan used to have a bilateral framing for its diplomacy with Beijing, very sturdy channel of navigating differences in their relationship. That has now basically been subordinated, I think, by Beijing to the US PRC relationship. Japan would like it not to be subordinated, but I think that's really where we're looking at the way China is responding to Japan. And then the flip side is Japan is becoming much, much more engaged in setting the table, the strategic table in the region, be it helping the maritime ASEAN neighbors with their capacity building in the maritime domain, be Coast Guard or otherwise. Japan, in its new strategic documents, which we can talk more about if you'd like, has also begun to introduce overseas security assistance. So it is now playing a far broader role in helping others in the Indo-Pacific be prepared for any kind of pressure on their own security. And this is a much more proactive Japan, and one that is not as hesitant as it used to be in the past to play a military role in the region. So let me stop there, Ralph.
Great, Sheila. Thank you very much. And thanks for beating the time limit. That's really setting a great example. I would mention that it's sort of disingenuous of the Chinese, the radioactive, quote unquote, waters that the Japanese are releasing at Fukushima are less radioactive, the treated waters, than the waters that come out of Chinese nuclear power plants today. So, you know, they that doesn't seem to have affected them too much or gotten them to not comment. But Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This has been a great discussion, and I'd like to build on it and get to Southeast Asia. My purpose is to assess the state of play in the competition between the United States and China in Southeast Asia. And why do I do this? Well, I mean, there's been a change in Southeast Asia. It used to be the U.S. was the leading power. Now, for the last 10 years, China has been seen as the leading power, and the U.S. has been seen in decline. Trump administration tried to change that in various ways, and it didn't work. And the U.S. continued to be seen in decline, and China continued to rise. But as Sourabh indicated, the Biden administration has its act together in dealing with Asia, including Southeast Asia, and it's been a lot more effective. And it's been active in this area effectively for over 2 years. And this has changed the dynamic up to a point. Now, there have been a whole series of recent studies looking at the state of play and who's leading in Southeast Asia. Is it China or is it the United States? The Asia Society has a big study. CSIS has one. Lowy Institute has several. And so this is quite important. And what they do, China is very powerful in Southeast Asia. It's very important to understand that. And maybe they don't have a strategy, and I would agree with Sourabh on that, but they have a way of doing things that has worked pretty well for them. It's basically economic enticements and coercive measures in various ways, including security forces as needed. And they have applied this very well and they now have their way in the South China Sea as far as ASEAN is concerned. And this is and there have been a whole host of things that show that the Southeast Asian countries are very unwilling to stand up to China because of these enticements and these coercive measures. So that's been effective. And then you look at the overall situation, and you see they have just a whole series of advantages vis-a-vis the United States and Southeast Asia. Common borders and proximity, control of the headwaters of major rivers that Southeast Asia depends on, a lasting position as the leading trader and largest or second largest investor in these areas. And Southeast Asian states are deeply invested in China. This has been going on for decades. And so gives the Chinese a great deal of advantage. In addition, the Chinese control significant regional transportation, communication, and other infrastructure, and large segments of the ethnic Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia and local media. They accommodate the corrupt practices of regional leaders in Southeast Asia. This doesn't get a lot of attention, but I think it's very important. And regional economies often depend on large numbers of Chinese tourists and students that are coming back after COVID. Now, the U.S. isn't without strengths. It has strengths, and the Asia Society report points to a number of strengths. It has its military networks are unsurpassed in the region. They are a strategic counterweight against Chinese expansionism. Foreign investment is important, and the large role of businesses and non-government sectors in interacting with the Southeast Asian countries on cultural, educational, and other matters. But in addition is the dimension that Sourabh talked about, which I think is and Sheila alluded to, is that the Biden people have come up with ways of creating synergy with the United States efforts in Southeast Asia, with countries like Japan. Look at all Japan is doing, that Sheila talked about. And they're working together on this. And Australia. And they've integrated them in effective ways. And then they've integrated others in this. And a lot of European powers are involved here. NATO is involved in this enterprise. And so this kind of practice, I think, is very effective in carrying out a policy that creates what Sourabh referred to, positions of strength. It's not being provocative. It's not hitting them on the head and saying, giving them grounds to go to war. It's just saying, we're in position here. We're in position that's going to be very hard for you to counter. And I think that's growing. And that's what we see underway. And I think, as Sourabh said, I give the Biden administration, an A- at least for their efforts in this regard. It's been quite effective. And let's see. And what you find as a result of this is that recent studies, very recent ones, I'm talking about the Lowy Asia Power Index of 2023. What does it show? It says China is stalled. It's not rising. China is, and it pointed to the economic measure of China's economic capacity, and it's at the lowest level since 2018. And the United States is again leading in this measure as far as their measurements is concerned. The countries involved here are 22 countries, including all 10 Southeast Asian members. And so this is a indication of a changing dynamic, with the United States being more important, still not the leader. China's, I think, still the leader, but this is a. And the Chinese government, at least in their media outlets and their commentaries, seem to be at times very worried about this. I think what Sourabh pointed to, they don't have a plan to deal with this. It seems to me yet, and so they've been on the defensive. And he mentioned, and I just will reiterate a couple of things. AUKUS. AUKUS isn't just about submarines. It's also about the cooperation among these three powers on a whole range of technology issues, economic issues, and other matters in addition. The Quad. I think Sourabh talked about the Quad quite well, and the summit meeting of the Quad was strongly condemned by the Chinese. They see this as a very serious player. And then you have even the Indo-Pacific economic framework. The media from China tends to look at that in a very negative way. And they see the United States encouraging Southeast Asian countries to get involved, and they don't really, they're wondering where this is going to go, and they're very critical of this kind of movement. But the heated rhetoric really comes out with the G7 and NATO involvement. They become very, the discussion of NATO in Asia, it's almost shrill what the Chinese media has to say about this. And so this is so the NATO summit in May, they saw that this is who attended? Well, Indonesia and Vietnam were there at this summit of the G7, and the Cook Islands represented the Pacific Island forums. So I've talked about the gains of the Biden administration in Oceania. It's very strong there. And then NATO. The defense minister at Shangri-La, he warned against NATO lying alliances in the Asia Pacific. And then the commentary on the Asian summit, which was the NATO summit, that was very critical of China in many ways, was very strong. And they targeted the Indo-Pacific Four. These are the four powers that are involved with NATO: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, on dealing with matters dealing with Asia. This is the kind of synergy that you see working together. These countries all working together in various ways. And what are they basically doing? They're building resilience. They're building resilience in the region that can deter China's expansionism, China's challenges. And they're not attacking China. They're building resilience. And so it's really hard to, and when Biden says, well, this isn't anti-China, well, it really isn't. They are talking with these other countries to make them stronger, make them richer, make them more strong, militarily powerful. They're not using them directly in an anti-China sort of way. Anyway, the strident anti-NATO rhetoric really overshadowed China's message at the foreign ministers meeting in Indonesia in 12-14 July, where Wang Yi warned against NATO expansionism in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and other commentary that pointed out that the United States is out to contain China. And most recently was the reporting on the Camp David summit. This is emblematic of the kind of thing you're seeing. What does this do? Well, it does many things. It has broad implications for the South Pacific as well as for the Southeast Asia. But it brings Korea into this in a very strong way, doing the kinds of things that Sheila was talking about in dealing with the region that works in the way that's coordinated and with the United States and Japan. And so what I see looking at this situation is that is a scorecard. And the U.S.-China competition in 2023 shows major gains relative to China, certainly in the Philippines, with much greater support from South Korea, along with ever stronger resolve and activism by Australia, Japan, India, Great Britain, the European Union, the G7, and NATO, all working on issues that affect Southeast Asia, like the South China Sea, as well as many other parts of Asia. And Beijing's response thus far has remained a mix of positive economic incentives along with negative coercive measures that has recently proved ineffective in countering the Chinese ambitions in places like the Philippines and South Korea. They have moved closer to the U.S. despite these kinds of practices up to this point. So what's the outlook in this type of situation? Well, Mr. Xi Jinping, to me, isn't known for changing his policies. He's been working for 10 years to get into power the way he is, and I think he's going to continue this kind of policy, barring some sort of change. But the Biden administration approach has a great deal of momentum, and I think this is going to get stronger. You'll see the symbiosis more and more, creating these positions of strength in the region. Looking out, what could change the situation? I agree. You could have a very different situation with the Donald Trump government. And I think that I think the Chinese would like a Donald Trump government because the Donald Trump government would not be effective in Southeast Asia working with allies and partners. It would be very complicating to have a crisis like that. One other point I would add, final point, that makes me think of the continuity in U.S. policy, even if Donald Trump is elected, is that all of these things that Sourabh was talking about, as far as advances are concerned, involved bipartisan majorities in the U.S. Congress. They were behind this all along, much more consistent than Trump, and more consistent than early Biden. They have favored this path since 2018, and they will continue. And these people made up their minds basically on their own. They're not doing partisan things. So they do that, but the fundamentals, though, it's basically there was no real push from public opinion, media, interest groups, or partisan reasons for them to get really upset about China. They looked at the situation, and that's what they did. And so they're continuing this. They've made up their minds, and so I don't think Mr. Trump is going to change that. And I think they fully support what Mr. Biden is doing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. Thank you to all three presenters. Three, I think, really terrific presentations and on time, which leaves a lot of time here for Q&A sessions. We have a chat room function. I'm sure most of our participants know how to use it if you have questions. I have a couple of questions that were sent in advance by members of the press, and we are on the record with this meeting, so I'll get to those in a minute, but I'll abuse the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question to each of the three of you. Sourabh, I was just in Kuala Lumpur for the Asia Roundtable. The first panel was on major power relations. Our Chinese speaker said, I think accurately, that there's been a mood change in the United States. Of course, he thought it was, faulty mood change, that China seems to be now the problem and the enemy. When I asked him why he thought that mood change have occurred, he didn't seem to come up with any reasons that would point a finger toward China or Xi Jinping thought. I'm wondering from your standpoint just how much Xi Jinping thought what I've called the Middle Kingdom mentality is in fact going to make it difficult for any future president, Democrat or Republican, to find common grounds with China. Sheila, on your standpoint, and Bob mentioned just briefly, but talk a little bit about the Camp David summit and how significant that was. My own perspective is that President Yoon put himself out there, really politically courageous and moving. And I think many are now going to see that the ball is in Japan's court and going to be looking for some gestures on Japan's part to sort of keep this trilateral going. What's your forecast or your prognosis on how this trilateral relationship is going to work out and its impact on countering China in Northeast Asia? And Bob, at the roundtable this year, a number of the ASEAN speakers lamented the fact that U.S.-China tensions was putting pressure on ASEAN and might render ASEAN irrelevant, quote unquote. But then when we got into discussions, it seems the two biggest challenges to ASEAN were Myanmar and Chinese activity in the South China Sea, neither one of which really directly attributed to U.S.-China tensions. So the question raises, how much is U.S.-China tensions in Southeast Asia a reason for ASEAN's problems or an excuse while they don't face up to the real challenges that they have? Sourabh, let's start with you. I would also say if any of you have a question or a comment on the other two's presentations, go ahead and make that as well now. But Sourabh, go ahead.
The point you raised about Xi Jinping, the exact point that you stated, just about a year or two back, there was a poll in Korea where basically Xi Jinping was polling beneath Abe. Japan, Korea have a very mixed relationship. They have their issues, history issues. And you'd think, and Abe is seen in some ways or was a revisionist in some ways. Why was Xi Jinping polling beneath Abe in Seoul? And that's something that they've not really thought through, that why this is the situation. I'm sure they've heard enough of this, but there's no point from the Chinese side to do pushback on this because Xi Jinping is there, he's firmly entrenched, he's going nowhere, and there's no point shouting against a wall, basically. And it might even be a dangerous thing to do. The problem at the Chinese end is that, Xi Jinping is seen in some respects as this dynamic guy, this aggressive guy, but on all the very important things that he needs to do, resolve or manage territorial issues or territoriality linked issues intelligently, he can't, he's like a 9-year-old girl. I can't take decisions, too hard. On doing structural economic reform, too difficult, too hard. Oh, I cannot do this. The problem with him, actually, he is stuck too much on important points to trying to maintain stability rather than making the call when he has accumulated so much political capital. And the problem for him is that from the early 2010s, the Obama administration, once China came out with the Made in 2025 plan, that was 2015. But, in those dialogue mechanisms, they were always told, China, you need to do this. Just please do this. It's high time for you to do that reform and that reform. And it was always promised, yes, that reform will happen tomorrow. It'll happen tomorrow. And it never happened. And at each event, it just kept on going further and further away. And at some point of time, and when Trump came in, the point became, we're not going to ask him for reform. We're just going to slap him down doing the things we want to do. And therefore, for the Chinese side, it came like, hey, where did this all come out from? And they're genuinely kind of stumped. Like, why are we in Cold War rivalry? Didn't we have these mechanisms and all? But in these very mechanisms, the things that they were told to do, they always promised and never did. And now those things are coming back, doubly hard. And so, that's part of the dilemma they're facing. And of course, Xi Jinping is as I said, he prizes stability, but he has such a negative impact in terms of optics anywhere outside China, in every country, maybe not Cambodia or places like that, that it's going to be just hard for them to have any credibility in terms of getting something reformist or something cooperative out of him. And my personal view is that he has chosen to lean on the side of the PLA in the bureaucratic competition between foreign ministry and PLA. And what the PLA says is not terribly imaginative, but it's like at least deterrence from China's perspective, but nothing gets resolved and the situation just goes on further and on.
Good. Sheila. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. You'd think we'd know by now, but the question about the trilate's really important, especially as we watch other relationships around the region in trilateral form really pick up on an agenda. You're looking at a US-Japan ROK that seems to always be in catch-up mode. The ambitions of the Camp David Summit really were to look forward and to institutionalize or regularize this high-level leaders summit, national security advisors meetings, foreign ministerial meetings, to elevate the trilateral consultations to the top level of all three governments. And I think you've got buy-in in Seoul and Tokyo and in Washington for that. The politics, as you know and know well, it is this question of the domestic politics. And here, President Yoon may be more vulnerable than President Biden or Prime Minister Kishida. He has a National Assembly election coming up in April next year. He's got a lot of opposition focused on his, relationship with Japan, and in particular on the forced labor piece of that case that still has to have Supreme Court approval of the Yoon cabinet's approach. But you also see China playing in that space in Seoul as well. And I don't know how our other two speakers have noticed that, opposition leaders are being invited to the ambassador's residence and then giving public remarks afterwards. So there's a real sort of Chinese play going on in Seoul to poke at the Yoon administration. I think the ambition of institutionalizing this trilateral is perfect. But to get to that end point, you have to institutionalize the bilat of the Japan, Korea. And here I want to give both. I think President Yoon deserves the lion's share, as you noted, of political risk, given his domestic foundation. Kishida himself is not doing so well at home for other reasons than his diplomacy. But Kishida, too, in hosting President Yoon at the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, paying particular attention to the Korean victims at Hiroshima, and speaking of the need for greater Japanese empathy for the past and the suffering of the Korean people, I think Kishida's also trying to meet Yoon as closely as he can in terms of those sensitive domestic issues. But again, we are watching this trilat move from a peninsular focus, which it's always been, into now this defined as an Indo-Pacific trilat. And you saw that in Phnom Penh last November when the three leaders met. You saw it again in those Camp David principles and the documents that came out. And I think that's where the energy is still coming from by all three leaders. They've embraced this Indo-Pacific framing for their relationship, which I think is a positive.
You think we could call it a virtual alliance?
Absolutely. But as long as we don't have to call it a virtual trilat, that's good.
Okay.
We're still working.
Bob, over to you.
Yeah, great comments, everybody. I just want to build on a couple of things. The First of all, on the U.S. as the cause of this problem of forcing us to choose, I think the Biden people are working really hard not to do that. I think these things are all formulated in a way that says, no, we want to work with you because you're X country, and we like you for X reasons, and we want to cooperate with you, and so forth. I don't think when Japan does this, I doubt they go around and say that this is designed to contain China. I mean, it can be done that way, and I think the Biden people are credible in this regard, and they're determined to play the game, and they're going to build friendly relations with the Southeast Asian governments, even though they're in the camp of China in some cases. And so maybe the U.S. still gets blamed for making countries choose, but I don't think they're really doing much. The administration is doing much of that. I think they're doing the opposite. I think they're playing the game. And which means that you build up relationships, where you build trust over the years, and I think it's time consuming, but that's what they're doing. If the Chinese do things, then they respond. Like the Philippines, for example, and things like that. But basically, I don't think all of these synergies that they're trying to build with Japan and Australia and India and European countries in Southeast Asia are forced. You got to choose between our side or the other side. I just don't see it. But I do see I just want to take off on what was said about Xi Jinping, because I think the United States is fortunate to have a leader like Joseph Biden. I mean, this guy can schmooze. He can talk to people that he disagrees with, and he can say, "Okay, you don't like." You don't like our Inflation Reduction Act. It gets in the way of your computer chip industry. What do we have to do to make it fix? What do we have to do to fix it for you? We make you a partner in some way in building chips and this type of thing. I think he's a very flexible type of person, can facilitate this kind of exercise. Plus, as Sourabh indicated, they do what they say they're going to do. They do it, and he has a record now, and they're doing it. And so I think that's a real strength. And I feel if it's as bad as Sourabh said about Xi Jinping, I feel sorry for the Chinese. I don't think it's quite that bad, but nonetheless, I think from the U.S. side, I think we have another good year or two with Joseph Biden. In Southeast Asia, competing with China, but doing it in ways that are effective and without, being provocative.
Ralph, can I jump in for 1 second and ask a question, actually, to both Sheila and frankly to you also, Ralph? Yeah. And this is on Camp David. From the Chinese end, in terms of China-Korea relations, the Chinese frame it this way. Obviously, the Koreans don't accept that framing, but maybe there is some sort of a consensus between Yoon's government and the Chinese, what the Chinese call the 3 no's and 1 restriction, where it's the 3 no's is won't participate in in a trilateral alliance. Presumably won't participate in trilateral alliance beyond peninsula issues, won't participate in missile defense system beyond presumably peninsula issues, will not add to THAAD, to the existing THAAD interceptors. And the restriction is that the existing THAAD interceptors will basically be put in whatever mode that they can't, whatever, do. The radars can't see in China, whatever. And the Chinese have seemingly, so all this is about on peninsula issues, you can get tight any of this thing in your relationship, and it doesn't have to US, Korea and Japan don't have to communicate via the US, y'all can be tight, but on extra peninsula issues ain't going to happen. That's the Chinese stance. And much of what, at least if you read closely the joint statement, one can make that case that is even there in those documents at Camp David. But also if one reads it kind of just very like a layperson, you'd think, oh, this is being extended now to the Indo-Pacific. And so my question is, where's South Korea on this? And has it kind of reneged on what it presumably had a consensus with China, or where is this going?
Good, Sheila, go ahead, and then I'll give my own 2 cents.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm not the Korea expert on the panel, but what's interesting about the watching now President Yoon is when he was running for office, he made a statement that he would have a second THAAD on the peninsula, right? And then that has kind of gone away since he's become president. I'm not sure whether the Chinese have exerted pressure or whether the South Koreans are being judicious in how they're presenting what they're actually interested in doing. One thing I think that's hovering below the surface and wasn't really apparent in the documents that came out from Camp David was an increased conversation on what to do and how to respond together to any kind of economic coercion. And for those of us, and especially for Ralph, who's been in these track 2 meetings, what happened after the THAAD deployment to Lotte and more broadly to China, to South Korea as a result of Chinese discomfort. This is now a sensitivity even in the US ROK alliance. Like what happens next if we do things together and China takes issue? And so there has been, I think, some quiet consultations going on about collective responses, maybe not formalized, but adding to the G7 conversation on an economic coercion council will be also a trilateral conversation on, well, what if the Chinese target, obviously Tokyo or Seoul, for some kind of behavior? Can we count on you to help us? And I think that's very healthy that Japan is now in that conversation, and it's not just a bilateral US ROK. But Ralph, over to you on the specifics.
Thanks, Sheila. First, I would mention at the roundtable, I made a comment about Chinese economic coercion, and our Chinese panelists said, "I wish you wouldn't use that term." And it was actually snickering in the audience, like if the shoe fits, let's go ahead and wear it. But I think that the 3 no's and whatever are a thing of the past. The Chinese created, I've argued in other forums that Xi Jinping is tactically clever but strategically foolish. The clampdown on the Korean government may have gotten him 3 no's at the beginning, but it really soured the mood in South Korea toward China. And the one of the few things that North and South Korea have in common is that neither one trusts the Chinese. The difference has been that for many years, the South Koreans thought that China was going to be part of the solution in dealing with the peninsula. Now the South Koreans, I think, for the most part, are convinced that China is part of the problem. It's not going to be part of the solution. So I think there's been a real mindset change. You pointed to it in some respect on Xi Jinping being less favorable than Abe, which you had to really work on to do in South Korea. But I think there has been a mood change, and I think it's part of a self-inflicted wound on the part of Xi Jinping. Bob, let me come back to you if I can. One of the questions, and I don't see other questions from participants, but we did have a question from our friends at Voice of America asking, how will the latest flare-up in tensions between China and the Philippines affect the geopolitical dynamics in the South China Sea? So I'd like you to take a shot at that. And then the other two are welcome to comment on it as well. But Bob?
Well, I think you're going to see the application of these synergies on the U.S. side. The protests against Chinese actions came not just from the Philippines and the United States. It came from a whole slew of countries when the August 5 episode took place. And lots of European countries, of course, Japan, Australia, and others. And so I need to check if South Korea was there or not on this one. But I did see that in the results of the Camp David summit, South China Sea was, this was the one area where they criticized China by name. They were very critical, and there's South Korea signing off on this. And they had a statement about Taiwan. And South Korea's president has gotten into hot water with China about what he said about Taiwan, and I haven't seen him retract his position that this is an international issue and it affects South Korea. So I think the synergy, it's spilling over. South Korea is joining with this group to be critical of China's position in the South China Sea, and I think therefore we're going to see politically, you're going to see more complaints about China's behavior. And then the latest episode that there was a resupply mission, I guess 2 days ago, by the Philippines through Second Thomas Strait, and the Chinese tried to block it, and the Chinese Coast Guard successfully waylaid a couple of Philippine Coast Guard ships, but the supply ships got through. And overhead for 3 hours was a U.S. surveillance plane, a Navy surveillance plane, watching it all. So I can't help but think that had something to do with the supplies getting through. So this is what I think we're just going to see more of this, with vocal support for those that are resisting overt coercive activities by the Chinese in the South China Sea. And the Philippine technique seems to be to publicize it, get it publicized. This is very different than in the past. And they're taking videos, and they're good quality videos, and you can see what's happening. So I think, again, these are actions that counter China and make it costly for them. And I think that's without shooting them.
Good. Other comments?
If I can just add, I'll keep it very brief. I think on the South China Sea, China is playing a losing hand. The problem in the South China Sea is it gives the impression that China does not just not follow international law, it doesn't understand international law. And that's a strong charge to make. And the problem in the South China Sea is that, the way China goes about territorial or territoriality linked settlements is it requires a very high level of good neighborliness from that other party to then move and try to meet the other party halfway. And that too, in a 6-corner or it's a 5-corner contest, you're not going to have good relations simultaneously with 5 parties to be able to manage peace and in the South China Sea. And China just has to figure a way to walk back some of its claims. It can do some of those very creatively. And it also bears noting that, China has got a lot of land boundary settlements, but every one of those land boundary settlements did not happened only when the other great power involved out there was no longer an adversary. For example, when the Soviet Union, when they had bad relations, none of its borders with the stands were not ready, were not solved, but they were all solved once China-Russia relations normalized after the Cold War, and China-Russia boundary was solved. And all the existing maritime boundaries, the China's main protagonist out there is the United States, and these all have ties. All these countries have maritime ties with the United States. So I don't see any of them being frankly resolved, and this is just going to blow up further, frankly. It's a losing hand.
Thank you. I might add, Bob and the others, at the Roundtable this year, the Southeast Asians were pretty quiet until the panel on the South China Sea. And then both the Philippine and the Vietnamese participants just laid it into the Chinese. It was sort of encouraging to see, after seeing so many years of sort of timidness on that issue. Let me go to the other question I have from our press folks, and then I'll go to some of the ones in the Q&A room. And this I'll start with Sourabh and Sheila, because Bob, you had already made a bit of comment on this topic, and that is, what is the outlook for an Asia-Pacific collective defense NATO-like structure, and what would be the steps needed to get there over how long? And that's from Mark Magner at the South China Morning Post.
So let me go to Sheila first. Sheila first this time.
So you're saving the easy ones for you.
Thank you. So Mark, nice to have your question. I don't see a NATO kind of formulation. And I have 2 reasons for that. Often we ascribe that to politics, especially with Japan. But I think actually a NATO type formulation, collective defense formulation, doesn't really work in the Asia Pacific due to geography, first and foremost. And second, the kind of defense threat that individual allies face now is very different than it was in the 1950s, when that was the vision. So China, if you're sitting in Australia looking at China, it's far away, but the maritime sea lanes and all kinds of ways China can impinge upon the security and prosperity of Australia, right? If you're sitting from Japan looking at China, you're looking at an existential threat, or what the Japanese will see as an existential threat. And that's what you saw in the last December's documents. What the challenge for the US-Japan relationship specifically is that we don't have integrated command structures. We don't have integrated contingency planning. We don't have what the US and ROK have, right? Which is a combined command and at least on the face of it, a combined vision of what could happen on the peninsula. So we'd have to work really, really hard. And I suspect that that's going to be the homework for the alliance going forward. But I don't see the Japanese then integrating that kind of cooperation with their military into the defense of another country. And I think that's where sometimes in Washington, the echo chamber starts talking about Japan needs to commit to the defense of Taiwan, when in fact, Japan will not commit to the defense of any other nation given its constitution. So I don't see it. I don't think it's necessary, first and foremost, but second, I don't see it as being effective in the region.
Good. Sourabh?
My view is exactly what I think she's already answered the way what I wanted to answer, which is, and frankly, which is, of course, I mean, each of these ROK Japan, ROK US, US Japan, where US and India are in terms of all these defense relationships are slightly different. They have slightly different focus. And what's going to be happening is we've seen the playbook written by this administration in trying to create this latticework of alliances and partnerships. And those latticework will grow with gaps within these structures, of course. And I think that's actually good because we don't want this kind of coagulate into hard structures. Think about it. Would you like coagulating into a hard structure between Japan, United States, and ROK, and North Korea, Russia, and China at the other end? I mean, we're talking moving towards where World War I was in the European theater. And so it's better it doesn't work that way. And it's good that these lattice works kind of get developed and get stronger. And depending on how China responds, there's obviously China has, I think, I'll put this way, which will hearten the Chinese. China still controls its own destiny. I mean, if it can get its national economic development in order, it can really cut through a lot of this, where economics dictates this, the broader geopolitics or the organization of Asia. I mean, the rise of consolidated central authority in China has historically been the source of peace, prosperity, and stability in the Asia Pacific. And all these countries in Southeast Asia understand that. The United States has been a great trustee over the last 75 years, and which also of the Asia Pacific, which also brings me to think, really, these two great trustees of this region, are they going to fight and tear the region apart? I don't think so. But of course, we can't take that for granted. But it's good that these latticework of webs and alliances grow with gaps in between, because that can cushion the impact of tensions, frankly.
Good, thank you. I'm personally in the club that has said an Asian NATO is sort of a foolish pipe dream, but an interesting thing, we did a study, Pacific Forum did a study last fall on the implications if Taiwan were to fall to China. It's available on the Pacific Forum website, www.pacforum.org. And what I found interesting was that several of and we had papers from Australia, from Japan, from Korea, from India, et cetera, in the US, several of the papers said that if Taiwan were to fall to China, that could be the catalyst for the creation of an Asian NATO. That this would be a serious wake-up call. Nobody would think China would stop at the door of Taiwan, and that this could, in fact, become the stimulus. It's sort of off the subject here, but I'll just sort of throw that out. If people are interested, they can go ahead and read the study, or there were a couple of PAC-nets that were done on it. We're running toward the end of time. There are a number of questions in the Q&A room. Most of them deal with economics, so I will throw these questions out and then ask you for any final comments that any of you have, either on that question or other comments that you want to make. And Rob, thank you, has already thrown out the issues and insights on the world after Taiwan falls, so we'll call your attention to that. But questions regarding economic issues and how that's going to affect U.S., China, and also China-EU relations over the next year. a question on when are people going to seriously take China's market manipulation seriously. And one other question, and Bob, will throw this one at you, is where does Vietnam fit in the geopolitical, geoeconomic trajectories that you've been talking about? So let me go in the order that you initially appeared. Sourabh, you're first, and closing thoughts as well.
Okay, I'll be quick, and to all I'm happy to have my email shared to the people who ask the questions if they want me to answer it subsequently in greater depth. What I would say is, don't rule out something really positive coming out of the third plenum later this October, or whenever that is going to be scheduled later in the fall. The third plenum usually has been the most reformist plenum. Of course, the third plenum of 2013, everybody talked about it as being this great reform. They talked about it for 6 years because it was never implemented. But in this last 1 week, and particularly from a European and Japanese perspective, and I would submit from a US perspective, Raimondo is going out there. Many of the grievances that have been expressed by foreign industry have been accommodated in a state council's opinion. And I think there's actually, the European Chamber came out with a fairly effusive statement saying if these are implemented, these go a long way to supporting the relationship. And the larger point out here is that China's economy is in a funk, but they are not doing the same thing of throwing money at the problem. They're trying to stimulate private investment by really teasing it out, by giving a lot of incentives, because they need to do other structural reforms. And we might be surprised about what might come out at the third plenum. So that's one part. A second part, I would say, is with regard to the market manipulation. Yes, that issue is there, but I would submit that is also more exaggerated than real. Frankly, the Chinese would say we are on the line for what we signed up to in the WTO, and if you prosecute us at the WTO if you had to. And in fact, the Trump administration even when it brought that huge case against China, the 301 tariffs against China, it brought a small case of the WTO, which it got resolved by China. And the point is, China has gone from a trade to an investment superpower. We don't have investment-related disciplines. The point is to lock it down with investment-related disciplines. The EU went some distance to it. Hopefully, if that happens, we might see, and it's in China's own interest to get these investment-related disciplines out there. There was one on Vietnam, or what was?
We'll leave Vietnam to Bob.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let me just leave it at this and not take other people's time.
Great, thank you. Sheila.
I'll be very brief because I am not the economic expert in the group. So, but I do think my concerns are this. First, us here in the United States. And I think when we're looking at the relationship with China and the region, we have to also factor in our decision-making on trade. Candidate Trump the other day just talked about how much he would enhance tariffs against China. So if America turns even further towards a more protectionist route and approach, I think we're going to have some geopolitical challenges, despite all of the great things that we talked about going on. The other is China's economic slowdown is going to impact others in the region. And already Japan is worried a little bit about what the long-term implications of this could be for their own economy. And the only last thing I'll say is foreign direct investment patterns will change given the policies that have changed in Europe, in North America, and in the region. So this is going to accelerate, but I'll turn it over to Bob because he's better versed in these things than I am.
Bob, over to you. In Vietnam.
I'm not an economic expert, but I think just one thought about economics. If the Chinese economy gets better and they're more attractive and more prosperous, that's going to complicate the United States' efforts in the region. It will make because for many reasons, but I think most of the countries in the region that work with the United States don't see the economic danger that the United States sees coming from China. This is very important for driving U.S. policy. It's the high technology competition we have with China. I think it's much more important than the arms race or the balance of power in Asia, frankly. So for American decision makers, this is fundamental. And so I think we'll take actions on our part. And that may not be along these lines, that will not be in sync with what the countries in the region want to do. or the European countries for that matter. On Vietnam, Vietnam is an area that a country that doesn't want to go forward with the United States rapidly at all. It's very slow. The U.S. is anxious to move forward with them. They're not anxious to move forward. They're worried about China, and so it's this very slow process. Biden is going there apparently in a couple of weeks. Maybe something will happen then, but it'll always be lagging behind China, and so the U.S. has to play that game, and they're playing it. They're going to have nice meetings, and they're going to make progress and build trust with Vietnam. And maybe Vietnam will then decide, if Biden gets reelected, then they'll say, oh, they got 4 more years of this guy. Then maybe they'll decide that that's the policies are stable. That the U.S. policies won't change significantly, and that the U.S. will be there when the Chinese put coercive power on them. The U.S. is doing a good job right now with the Philippines showing that, and I think that's the kind of thing that Vietnam would probably require implicitly if they leaned a bit more toward the United States in a way that would risk their antagonizing Beijing. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm probably a little more positive on Vietnam than you, but Rob, that might be a good subject for your next comparative connection roundtable. So over to you.
Thank you, Ralph. I want to thank you and our 3 speakers for these great presentations and for taking their time to share their insights with us. Special thanks to Ralph, as always, and although I'm a day late, happy birthday. I also want to thank all of you who submitted questions and contributed to this discussion. I'm confident that those of you who joined us today gained from it as well. And if you are not familiar with Comparative Connections or have not yet taken time to read it, this is the quality of analysis you can expect with each issue. We will publish our next volume in a little under a month on September 15th, which you can view by visiting our website at cc.pacforum.org. You may download the entire issue in PDF form at the top of the page, as well as download individual chapters or simply read them online. We hope that you will read Comparative Connections, cite it in your own work, and help us spread the word. If you want to support the journal, support more events like this, and help us grow, please contact our development team at development@pacforum.org. We have a range of sponsorship options that can help you help us. Thank you all once again, and we will see you in the near future. Stay well and stay safe.
Great. Aloha.